Hey everybody, this is McCaver here, and today we're going to talk about what happens with the Great Depression and really what happens with the responses from various countries around the world to the Depression and all those dynamics and how they really set up eventually World War II. Alright, so where does this begin? Well, it begins with reminding ourselves exactly what the state the rest of the world is in during this time period. Only the United States and Japan came out of World War I in better shape than they did going into it. We had profited from selling weapons to both sides of the war, and the Japanese now profited from all the additional colonies that they had taken from the Germanys and other areas in East Asia as well. So, this is great. And with the US, our stock market is raging, everything is fantastic, and we had so much money that we felt okay with the notion of sending some to Europe to help rebuild their nations. So, with that in mind, realize that the rest of the world is really struggling. And we are acting as the nice guys, really trying to help other people out during this period. The rest of Europe is bankrupt. Most European nations had spent billions upon billions of dollars during this period of fighting to fund their own war efforts. And then you had countries like Germany that had to pay ridiculous war reparations. You had the Soviet Union is now trying to reshape its entire economy. So we have a huge situation. There's just not enough money to what's going on. So, what do we do with this? Well, we have a few efforts in regards to what takes place after World War I. Democratic government is new in a lot of Europe during this time period. Most of the nations in this area had largely relied on kings and empires, and now that most of those nations have been broken up, new governments were put into place, and there wasn't the tradition there for them to really be successful. You also have the whole situation of Russia becoming a communist totalitarian dictatorship, which we will totally get into more later on. But, yeah, death of Lenin leads us to the rise of Stalin. Stalin is easily considered Mount Rushmore, worst people to have ever lived. So yeah, other countries are going to deal with this in different scenarios. Places like France and Italy are going to create coalition governments, which are going to be temporary governments where the parties are forced to work together because no party has a majority over the government at any given time. So you had different political parties working together in order to progress the future of the nation. Kind of sounds like an ideal situation, except in these countries it's not going to be that great. So, this is the state of Europe. And it's easy to also remind everyone that the bitter nature of the Treaty of Versailles is going to lead to a lot of countries really not being happy. And there will be disagreements over various parts of land and agreements that were laid out in the Treaty of Versailles that are going to lead to other confrontations and conflicts during this period. Alright, so everything's having its issues right now, and let's give it a shot. So a lot of changes in government leads to instability in a nation, and that will prevent long-term economic success. Europe is used to authoritarian leadership. It is not used to democracy. Democracy takes time, and it is hard. In a country that's rebuilding from the most cataclysmic war the world had ever seen, time and patience are not things that people have a lot of. So this is going to be a problem. So let's look at Germany. Germany is going to attempt to build themselves a republic after the fall of the Kaiser. And we call this republic the Weimar Republic. Spelled with the W, pronounced with a V, welcome to German. It is really just kind of unstable from the get-go, and it's really unfortunate. The reality is that Germany was put in such a terrible situation due to the Treaty of Versailles that nothing this republic would ever do would ever be able to dig it out of the hole that the European powers placed upon Germany at the end of the conflict. It did not have experience, the German people did not have experience in dealing with the democracy, and because of all of the problems that came out of the Treaty of Versailles, the Weimar Republic will be blamed for all of them. They are the government, the representation of all the things that went horribly wrong at the end of World War I. So because of this, it's just a total failure in every way, shape, and form. And a large portion of that is due to the economic problems, particularly inflation. German inflation is catastrophic. In fact, it becomes so bad that economists have to coin a new term for how bad inflation can get, and it goes from just being inflation to hyperinflation. Let's put this out there for you. During the course of 1 year, the value of the German mark dropped exponentially. A loaf of bread that would have cost about 2 German marks prior to World War I cost somewhere in the range of 10 billion marks after the war, reaching an all-time low of 200 billion marks for a single loaf of bread by 1923. Think about that for a second. 200 billion marks. There is no single person in the world today that has $200 billion of American currency. So you can imagine how much that meant for the average person and how catastrophic that was for the average person. It was terrible. You couldn't afford to buy food. And German economy is going to revert back so far that they become effectively a barter society where they trade things amongst each other because the currency is so useless. $200 billion is a joke. It's like Dr. Evilish money at this point. So eventually the United States is going to realize that someone has to step in and help Germany. And we actually get an idea by a guy named Charles Dawes. He is a banker in the United States who comes up with the idea of giving a $200 million loan from the United States, not particularly from its government, but from banks within the United States, that will help jumpstart the German economy. This Dawes plan, as they called it, clearly after the guy who looks like Charlie Sheen, Charles Dawes, was designed to jumpstart the German economy to help them be able to pay off the reparations that they were forced to pay. Also, a part of this was that they rescheduled when those payments were supposed to come in to give the German people time to rebuild themselves first, and then have to start paying off the debts to other countries. Eventually, this idea is even scrapped for a much more progressive concept, brought up the Lausanne Conference, which tosses out the notion that Germany has to pay any more reparations to a European power. Germany will be left on its own to finally rebuild itself and rebuild its economy in a viable fashion. And this is going to be huge for Germany, and Germany's actually going to start picking itself up off the floor and rebuilding itself. And Germany is going to revolve, or at least involve themselves back in European affairs. Even relations between France and Germany will start to improve. And 1925, at the city of Locarno, the two decide that they will never again decide to solve conflict between the two of them using violence. Germany agrees to respect French and Belgian borders, and because of that it is admitted into the League of Nations. And this is supposed to be a dramatic step forward for diplomacy in Europe. But the problem is that there is no enforcement to this treaty, because the League of Nations had no armed forces. The only way the League of Nations could back up any of its statements is if countries wanted to back them up. And that's not really an ideal way of doing business. If you're a country, you don't want to rely on other people just for the ability to protect your own borders. But, in theory, Europe is moving forward. But we will bring it all crashing down. You guys know a little bit about the Great Depression. You've had basic concepts about it. Your parents might have talked about it. Your grandparents may have even lived through it. But I'm going to try to summarize very simply what the Great Depression was for the United States. Once World War I ended, the rest of the world, save for Japan and the US, were in a cataclysmic depression. People were unemployed, there weren't jobs, buildings destroyed. The United States didn't have that problem because of the amount of money that we made. But we were making so much money, people started introducing the ideas of buying things on credit. Because it was just a foregone conclusion that people were going to be making more and more and more money, people were effectively borrowing money to buy something now that they're eventually going to make later. And that is such a fundamental aspect of our economy today. Every adult you know has some form of credit, whether it's a car, whether it's a home, whether it's a credit card, whether it's all of the above, a student loan, something. All of this is fathomed parts of the credit concept out there. And that's just how we live. But back then, people didn't really understand how to work with credit. They didn't understand that you need to balance credit. You need to understand that you can't take out more than you can eventually pay off. So people started buying so much on credit and then not actually being able to pay it off. And that's when everything hits the fan. And in September 1929, investors became really worried about how fast the stock market was growing. You can see in this chart that throughout the 20s, it just kept going up and up and up and up and up. And then on October 29th, everything collapses. Catastrophic. It becomes so bad overnight that banks no longer had the money to give people back what they had stored with them. So say you had $10,000 in your account. The bank didn't have that money. So you couldn't go to the bank and ask them for it because they didn't have anything. Your money was gone. The bank goes out of business. Everything in the country stops almost overnight. Farms destroyed because they can't get loans to be able to farm their own stuff, to buy seed, buy materials, buy tools. 9 million people lost their life savings through no fault of their own, but because banks had spent so much money in an effort to constantly grab more and more profit. That 9 million people's life savings disappeared. At its worst, unemployment in the United States reached 25%. 1 in every 4 people could not find a job. And as you can see, Black Tuesday is just the tip of the iceberg. The Depression gets progressively worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And it doesn't really recover until World War II. Because once we start making things for the war again, things start to pick back up. But when the United States hits it, it's catastrophic. Because as a common theme in history, when something bad happens to a group of people, you can always expect the other shoe to drop. And in the United States, the other shoe drops just afterwards. Great Depression hits in 1829, and shortly thereafter, the worst drought in U.S. history breaks out. And a period that we call the Dust Bowl is rampant across the Midwest. The breadbasket of the world can't produce food because there's no water. We see entire towns become enveloped in dust storms because it's so dry. And everything starts to fall apart. As you can see from this, the dust storms cripple the U.S. This is where our food comes from in this country. And huge chunks of it were completely incapable of farming anything. So now people are starving. And all those banks, all the government loans to other countries around the world that we had lent them to help them rebuild themselves, we asked for all of it back. And it would be like if China decided to take all the money that we owed them back. And it would be like, whoops, new country, hey. Well, once we do that, all the countries that we're rebuilding, the Germanys, the Frances, the Britons, they all collapse again too. And we see various different solutions to try to deal with Great Depression round 2 around the world. First, we see the creation of national coalitions in Great Britain. This was supposed to help rebuild the government, and we introduced this party called the Labour Party. It was supposed to be build the country by the labor force back up. And that would be great. But unfortunately, they are stuck dealing with another problem that they have put off now for what seems like a couple 100 years. The Irish have been waiting patiently again and again and again upon insistence by the British that they will eventually come to some sort of solution as to what to do with Ireland. And we start to see after World War I, those organizations no longer willing to wait. Groups like Sinn Féin, led by Michael Collins, are going to try to force the British to make a decision and free Ireland. So they'll create their own guerrilla warfare. Michael Collins is an Irish hero because he is willing to fight the war that no one else will fight in a way that no one else thought could be fought. And because of that, he will get the British to give control of Ireland back to the Irish people, except minus the 12 colonies in the north, which is a bit of a problem even today. This is an interesting quote. Think what have I got for Ireland, something which she has wanted for these past 700 years. Will anyone be satisfied with this bargain? Will anyone? I tell you this. Early this morning I have signed my own death warrant. And he knew exactly what he was getting into. He got the lower portion of Ireland free, but it was not enough, and eventually he will be assassinated by people he used to consider his own friends. But because of these situations, the British ability to respond to the Great Depression has slowed down. In France, we have a Front Populaire, and people who speak French should be able to read this slide, but I'm betting many of those French scholars out there are struggling a little bit. And if you are, hey, wait, the next slide tells you. It's a coalition of socialists, communists, and moderates who are going to try to help fight things. In fact, they will actually help push for things like a 40-hour work week and paid vacation, but it doesn't really fix anything. These ideas are great. They're fundamental to our working force today, but they don't really fix the Great Depression in France. So there it goes. Instead, we see other countries in Europe, particularly Northern Europe, just adopt socialism. Norway, Sweden, and Denmark decide that they're going to take a socialist approach to things, which is a slower recovery, but through higher taxes, they were able to create public works that allowed people to get jobs again. And those jobs then stayed, and then once the economy was rebuilt, people could then transition to other types of jobs, and they've largely maintained stability throughout this period and then the next, 70, 80 years since. And this is kind of if you're going to say a saving grace for this concept, this is it. This is the most moderate and functional representation of modern socialism in today's world. Back in the United States, we kind of take a different route. The new president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, decides that he is going to become the most active president in human history. He's going to repair the economy by just building everything. And his New Deal was designed about creating projects for workers to come home to build bridges, build dams, build electrical networks, whatever it is. And also create something called Social Security. And the idea with Social Security was that it would encourage older people to leave the workforce, to allow younger people to move into the workforce, and then start to stabilize the population and the workforce in the country a little bit more. And it's largely very effective. But all of these ideas are significantly better than what a couple other nations do in dealing with the Great Depression, and that is they turn to fascism. But that's the topic for tomorrow. Thanks and have a great day. Bye-bye.